Welcome to Femme Fantasy, where transformation, elegance, and self-discovery come to life. I never thought a single mistake could unravel everything I'd built. One careless decision, one moment of weakness, and suddenly my life had become a game I didn't know the rules to. I came home that evening expecting the usual quiet hum of our house, the soft smell of dinner, the comforting weight of normalcy. Instead, I found silence, too heavy, too sharp. My wife was standing in the living room, her eyes fixed on me with a calm that was almost terrifying. There was no yelling, no trembling voice, just a quiet intensity that made my stomach twist. "I know," she said simply. And in that word, she held everything. My heart sank, and a cold wave of dread washed over me. I had imagined confessions, fights, desperate apologies, but never this. Her calmness was worse than rage. It was control. And control was exactly what she planned to wield. I tried to explain, to excuse myself, to rationalize what had been undeniably wrong. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small box, unassuming, almost innocent. My eyes followed her hands with a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. Inside were things I didn't recognize at first, soft fabrics, delicate garments, and a note that simply said, "You will understand." "What is this?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady, though every instinct screamed to flee. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she circled me slowly, studying my reaction like a scientist observing an experiment, every step deliberate. The weight of her gaze made me feel exposed, stripped of the arrogance that had carried me through months of careless decisions. "You need to understand who you are," she finally said, her tone gentle but unyielding. "Not the person you pretend to be outside, but the one you've been avoiding inside." My stomach churned. I didn't understand. How could this have anything to do with my betrayal? But her eyes left no room for argument. This was no ordinary punishment. It was something far more personal, far more transformative. Before I could protest further, she instructed me to follow her to the bedroom. The door clicked behind us, and I realized that, for the first time, I wasn't in control. Every instinct screamed to resist, but deep down, a tiny part of me wondered what it would feel like to see myself through her eyes. She handed me one of the garments. A dress. Soft, flowing, inconceivably feminine. I laughed nervously, a hollow, disbelieving sound. "This isn't funny," she said sharply. "You will wear it. Every step. Every day. Until you truly understand the consequences of your choices." My mind raced, panic clawing at me. This was absurd, humiliating, impossible. And yet, beneath the fear, a flicker of something else stirred, a strange curiosity, a reluctant fascination I wasn't ready to name. I stepped forward, trembling, and took the fabric in my hands. The texture was unlike anything I'd ever felt, smooth, comforting, frightening. As I held it, I realized that my life, my identity, everything I thought I controlled, was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to predict. And deep inside, I knew that the first step had already been taken. The first time I put on the dress, I felt every nerve in my body scream in protest. My hands shook as I ran them over the soft fabric, as if touching it could somehow erase the humiliation I already felt coursing through me. My reflection in the mirror startled me, not just because I looked different, but because for the first time, I was forced to confront myself without any of the armor I had relied on for years. The person staring back wasn't the man I'd thought I was. The face, framed by the careful folds of the dress, seemed softer, more vulnerable, almost fragile. I wanted to laugh at how ridiculous it was, but laughter caught in my throat. She stood behind me silently, watching, waiting. The calm in her eyes hadn't faltered. "You see," she said quietly, "this isn't just about clothes. It's about understanding every choice you've made, every person you've hurt, and how it feels to be exposed, to be vulnerable in ways you've never allowed yourself to be." My chest tightened. The words were not accusatory. They were precise, surgical, and the weight of them pressed into me like a tide I couldn't push back. I tried to walk, to move naturally, but my body felt foreign. The sway of the dress, the way the hem brushed against my legs, the subtle shift in balance, it was disorienting. Every movement was a reminder that control, the one thing I had always believed was mine, was slipping away. And yet, even as my pride rebelled, a strange awareness began to creep in. The softness of the fabric, the careful way it conformed to my body, felt almost comforting. Not comforting in the way a cozy sweater does, but in a way that forced me to notice myself, to feel myself in a way I never had before. Her instructions were relentless. Wear it at home. Practice walking. Speak softly. Notice how the world sees you now. Each command cut deeper than I expected. I could feel the sting of my own mistakes mirrored in the gentle folds of fabric around my arms. And then came the hardest part. My wife asked me to take off my watch, my tie, everything that felt like armor, and look in the mirror again. I did. And for the first time, I didn't recognize the person looking back. Not entirely. There were traces of the man I had been, but they were muted, softened, reshaped. I wanted to protest, to tear the dress off, to reclaim myself, but I couldn't. Her presence, unyielding and calm, held me in place. And beneath the panic, beneath the embarrassment, there was a whisper of curiosity. Who was this person I saw in the mirror? Could I become someone capable of feeling more than I ever allowed myself? Could I see the consequences of my actions clearly, if only through this strange, impossible lens? By the end of that first night, I was exhausted. Not physically, but in a way that went deeper, shaking the foundations of how I defined myself. I realized the punishment wasn't humiliation alone, it was reflection, exposure, transformation. And for the first time, I wondered if I would ever be the same again. The following morning, I woke to the quiet hum of the house, sunlight spilling through the blinds in long, accusatory beams. I could hear her moving in the kitchen, methodical, calm, as if she had orchestrated this entire day to strip me of every illusion I had about myself. My stomach twisted as I realized I would have to face her fully dressed in the feminine clothes she had chosen, and the thought of it made my pulse pound. But there was no hiding, no escape. This was the life I had to step into, at least for now. I dressed slowly, my fingers fumbling with buttons and clasps that were unfamiliar. The mirror reflected a person I barely recognized. My shoulders seemed narrower, my frame softer, and the dress clung in ways that were impossible to ignore. For the first time, I was forced to notice the details. The curve of my neck, the way my hair framed my face differently when I lowered my chin, the subtle shift in posture that the dress demanded. I felt exposed, not in a physical sense, but in a way that cut deeper, leaving me raw and vulnerable. She entered the room with a cup of coffee, her gaze calm but piercing. "Good morning," she said, voice steady, almost casual. But I knew better. Every word was a test, every glance a reminder of the consequences of my choices. I tried to return her greeting, but my voice sounded strange, softer than I was used to, almost foreign to my own ears. I swallowed, and the sound echoed in my mind like a confession I couldn't take back. "Sit," she instructed, and I obeyed, feeling the unfamiliar shift of the dress against the chair. "Look at yourself," she said. "Really look. This is who you are now, at least until you understand the impact of what you did. Do you feel it?" I did feel it, though I couldn't have named it. Shame, humiliation, curiosity, and an unexpected sense of clarity all tangled together, tightening around me like a knot I couldn't unravel. She handed me a notebook, its cover plain, almost clinical. "Write down everything you think, every feeling, every reaction. I want you to confront your emotions, not ignore them. This is part of your transformation." My hands shook as I accepted it. Writing had never been a punishment, yet now the act felt heavy, a mirror to my thoughts and choices. I stared at the blank pages, the pen trembling between my fingers, and for the first time, I wondered who I truly was beneath the ego, beneath the lies, beneath the careless decisions that had led me here. Hours passed as I wrote, the sunlight shifting, casting shadows across the room. I wrote about fear, guilt, embarrassment, and curiosity. I wrote about the strange comfort of the dress, the foreign softness against my skin. I wrote about my reflection, about the realization that vulnerability could be a kind of power if I allowed it. And when I finally looked up, my wife was watching me again, silently, but with a look that was not anger or scorn. It was understanding, and it terrified me even more. By evening, I felt a strange exhaustion, a depletion that went deeper than physical fatigue. My identity felt unsteady, malleable, shifting with every movement, every glance, every self-reflection. I realized that this punishment was not merely about making me pay, it was about reshaping me, forcing me to see myself fully, without excuses, without walls, without armor. And for the first time, I wondered whether I was capable of embracing it, or if I would spend the rest of my life resisting the inevitable transformation that had already begun. The next morning, I woke to a quiet house once again, but something had shifted inside me. The panic from the first day had dulled into something more complicated, an uneasy awareness of myself that I couldn't escape. My reflection in the mirror no longer startled me as much, but it still held that strange duality, traces of the man I had been, tangled with the softer, uncertain presence the dress revealed. I hated it, yet part of me couldn't look away. She appeared in the doorway, holding a small basket of carefully chosen accessories. "Today," she said, voice calm, "you're going to learn how presentation shapes perception." My stomach tightened. Accessories. The thought alone made my chest constrict, because it meant there was no longer any pretending, no longer any halfway measure. I had to commit to the persona she was constructing for me, at least outwardly, and the realization was suffocating. One by one, she handed me items, delicate earrings, a thin scarf, a small hair clip. "These aren't optional," she said. "If you want to understand, you must participate fully. The transformation isn't just clothing, it's every detail, every movement, every gesture." My hands shook as I held the items. The unfamiliarity of it all made me feel like a stranger in my own body. I tried to make a joke, something light, but it fell flat. Her expression didn't change, and I realized that levity was not allowed here. As I sat in front of the mirror, adding each item, she guided me with precise instructions. "Adjust the scarf, tilt your head, soften your gaze." I followed reluctantly at first, every fiber of me resisting, but slowly, I began to notice the effect. The reflection in the glass no longer felt entirely alien. There was still discomfort, but there was also a strange clarity. The face looking back at me wasn't the same as yesterday. It was someone learning, someone bending to the demands placed upon them, someone who could no longer hide behind arrogance or ignorance. When I finished, she stood behind me, inspecting her work. "Look at yourself," she said softly. "See what the world sees. Feel what it feels like to be noticed in a way you've never allowed yourself to be." I stared at the reflection, and for the first time, I noticed subtleties I had ignored before. The curve of my cheek, the way my eyes caught the light differently, the gentle sway of the dress against my frame. My body, my reflection, my identity, it all felt like a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. Throughout the day, she made me move, practice gestures, sit and stand in ways that emphasized unfamiliar grace. Each motion felt awkward, every step a reminder that my body wasn't mine in the way I thought it had been. And yet, beneath the awkwardness, there was a flicker of something I couldn't name. Power, perhaps, or maybe awareness. I was learning to inhabit a space I had never truly understood, to feel what it meant to be seen without defenses. By evening, exhaustion returned, but it was layered now. Fatigue mingled with curiosity, humiliation with insight. I realized the punishment was not a single act but a process, and each day peeled back another layer of my self-conceit, forcing me to confront truths I had long avoided. The reflection in the mirror no longer mocked me, it challenged me. And as I stood there, alone with my thoughts and my changing self, I knew that I was on a path from which there was no simple return, a path toward a transformation that would demand everything I had never been willing to give before. The days blurred together in a rhythm I couldn't escape. Every morning, the reflection in the mirror demanded my attention, each glance a reminder that I was no longer the person I thought I was. The dress, once alien and mocking, had begun to feel like a second skin, soft, restrictive, intimate. I hated the way it made me conscious of every movement, every shift of weight, every line of my body. And yet, it forced me to notice myself in ways I had never allowed. My wife's voice echoed in my mind constantly, precise and deliberate. Notice. Feel. Understand. One afternoon, she handed me a compact mirror and instructed me to examine my face in detail. "Not just superficially," she said. "See yourself for who you are now." My hands trembled as I traced the contours, the gentle curves of my cheeks, the subtle shift of my jawline. For the first time, I saw vulnerability not as weakness but as clarity. My mistakes, my betrayal, all the arrogance I had carried, it was all written on my face in ways I couldn't disguise. I felt exposed, raw, and a strange sense of humility began to creep in. She made me practice speaking differently, softly, deliberately, adjusting my tone, my inflection, my rhythm. It was exhausting, and at first I resisted, embarrassed by the sound of my own voice. But gradually, I noticed the subtle changes in how I carried myself, how others, my wife, even my own reflection, perceived me. It was a revelation that terrified me. Control could be taken, reshaped, and even denied, but awareness could not. I was learning to inhabit this new self whether I liked it or not. One evening, after hours of practice and reflection, she sat across from me and said something that unsettled me more than any punishment had so far. The outer changes are only the beginning. What matters is what you see inside yourself. Will you hide, or will you confront it? Her gaze was steady, unwavering. I realized that for the first time, I was forced to confront the shame I had buried beneath arrogance, the emptiness I had ignored, the selfishness I had justified. Every movement, every glance, every gesture in this new persona stripped me further of pretense. By this point, the transformation was no longer just physical. It was emotional, psychological, a slow unraveling of who I thought I was and what I believed I controlled. The dress, the accessories, the voice, even the way I sat, they were instruments, each one designed to force me to face myself. And it worked. I hated it, yet I couldn't deny the clarity it brought. Every day, I became more conscious of my actions, my presence, and my impact on those around me. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. The face looking back was softer, gentler, but unmistakably mine. And yet, beneath it all, there was a tremor of unfamiliarity, a question of who I might become if I continued down this path. For the first time, I realized that the punishment wasn't about humiliation or control alone. It was about forcing me to understand empathy, to feel exposure, to see my flaws reflected not as shame but as lessons. And I understood, with a mix of dread and reluctant acceptance, that I was no longer just a man in a dress. I was someone being remade, whether I wanted it or not. By the 6th day, the rhythm of my punishment had settled into something relentless and inescapable. Mornings began with the same procedure. Dressing in the clothes she had chosen, practicing movement, adjusting the smallest details until each gesture felt deliberate. I had long since stopped fighting the fabric itself. It clung to me, soft and unyielding, like a mirror of my own conscience. My reflection no longer startled me. It challenged me, held me accountable in ways words never could. And yet, despite the daily repetition, I still felt unease twisting through my chest, a persistent tension that refused to leave. The most difficult moments came not from the dress or the voice training or the accessories, but from the silence between instructions. My wife would watch me work, sometimes for hours, not offering guidance or criticism, but letting me stumble, let me notice myself failing, then succeed in increments I hadn't realized I was capable of. There was no rage in her eyes, no mockery, only an unwavering calm that made every mistake feel heavier. I began to understand that this was not just punishment, it was exposure, the stripping away of every mask I had worn, every excuse I had relied upon, until all that remained was the raw, unvarnished version of myself. One afternoon, she brought me a new mirror, full-length and unframed, leaning it against the wall. "I want you to observe yourself in motion," she said. "Not just your reflection, but the way you inhabit space. Every posture, every step, every glance at yourself. It matters." I stared at the mirror, hesitant, unsure if I wanted to see the person waiting for me on the other side. But I knew I had no choice. Slowly, tentatively, I walked across the room, my movements stiff and unnatural at first. The dress swayed around my legs, the soft fabric brushing my calves, a constant reminder of the vulnerability I now carried with me. It was exhausting, physically and mentally. Every motion required thought, every gesture demanded awareness. I stumbled once, my foot catching on the hem, and she didn't intervene. I felt a flush of embarrassment that went beyond the physical. It was the shame of imperfection, of being caught in a moment I couldn't control. But then she simply said, "Recover. Keep moving. Notice yourself." And I did, adjusting my posture, softening my steps, feeling a strange pride in the way I could adapt, in the way my body slowly began to obey this new set of rules. That evening, she handed me a journal. "Write everything again," she instructed. "Not just what you see, but what you feel. Every fear, every hesitation, every subtle change you notice. This is as much part of the process as the clothes or the voice or the movement." I sat for hours, the pen trembling in my hand, writing about the growing awareness that I was no longer the man I had been, at least not fully. I wrote about the vulnerability I felt in every movement, the self-consciousness that lingered even when no one was watching, the subtle thrill of noticing beauty and grace in ways I had never allowed myself to see. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to realize something deeper. This wasn't just punishment for infidelity. It was a reckoning. I was being forced to confront empathy, self-awareness, and the quiet power of vulnerability. Each day of exposure, each practice of softness and awareness, chipped away at my arrogance and left something new behind, a tentative understanding that being seen fully, without masks, could be terrifying but also clarifying. I had no idea where this path would lead, but for the first time, I felt that I might survive it, and perhaps even emerge from it changed in ways I couldn't yet name. By the 7th day, a strange rhythm had taken hold in the house. I no longer dreaded the dress itself. It had become a constant presence, a second skin I could not shed, even if I wanted to. But the unease hadn't left me. If anything, it had deepened. The true weight of the punishment wasn't the fabric or the mirrors or the careful instructions, it was the constant confrontation with myself. Every glance in the mirror, every step across the room, every soft intonation of my voice reminded me that I had no escape from the consequences of my actions. That morning, she asked me to stand still in front of the largest mirror yet, a full wall of glass that reflected not just my body, but the space around me. "Look," she said, "and tell me what you see. Not what you want to see, not what you think I want you to see. What's really there?" My chest tightened, my stomach churned, and I hesitated. The reflection was unflinching. There was me, the man I had been, softened, reshaped, vulnerable. But there was also someone else. Someone fragile yet unmistakably present. Someone learning to inhabit a space without the shields I had always relied on. I tried to speak, but my voice caught, thin and uncertain. I see someone different," I admitted, my eyes glued to the reflection. She nodded slowly, not judgmental, but with a weight that made my heart pound. "Different," she said softly, "isn't always easy. Sometimes it's frightening. Sometimes it's enlightening. But it's necessary if you're going to understand yourself." Her words sank into me, heavier than any scolding, more relentless than any lecture. It was one thing to dress differently, to move differently, to speak differently. It was another entirely to face the person in the mirror and recognize the consequences of your choices written plainly in every line of your face, in every gesture you made. She made me practice walking again, slowly, deliberately, across the mirrored floor. Each step felt unnatural, each sway of the dress unfamiliar. But as I moved, I began to notice subtleties, the gentle flow of the fabric, the way my body shifted weight, the way my posture demanded awareness. My reflection wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was a teacher. Every misstep, every stumble, every tiny adjustment became a lesson in humility and observation. I realized with a sinking thrill that she was forcing me to inhabit a self I had never allowed myself to know, and in doing so, stripping away every layer of pride I had used to protect myself. By the afternoon, exhaustion had set in, but it was accompanied by something new, reflection. Not just about the dress, or the practice, or the voice, but about my choices, my lies, my betrayals. The process of inhabiting this new self forced me to think about empathy, about perspective, about how it felt to be scrutinized and exposed. And yet, beneath the discomfort and the humiliation, I felt a flicker of clarity. I began to understand that this transformation wasn't a punishment in the traditional sense. It was a reckoning, a slow, deliberate excavation of the self I had hidden from both my wife and myself. That evening, when I finally collapsed in front of the mirror, pen and journal in hand, I wrote longer than I ever had. I wrote about shame and fear, about awkwardness and revelation. I wrote about the tenderness I began to notice in myself, and the growing awareness that vulnerability didn't necessarily mean weakness. The person staring back at me, framed by flowing fabric, subtle accessories, and the softened contours of my own body, was both alien and familiar. And for the first time in years, I understood that who I had been, the careless, arrogant, selfish man, was no longer all there was. Something new had begun, fragile, uncertain, and undeniably real. By the 8th day, the transformation had begun to settle into a rhythm, though not without resistance. The initial shock of the clothes, the mirrors, and the instructions had dulled, replaced by a relentless awareness of myself in every gesture, every glance, every breath. I moved through the house differently now, slower, more deliberate. Even my posture had shifted, subtle yet unmistakable. like water slowly reshaping stone. I hated that I had begun to notice these changes, hated that they made me feel vulnerable and alive at the same time. That morning, she handed me a new set of instructions. This time, I was to perform a series of tasks while maintaining the persona she had been molding for me: soft movements, gentle speech, careful gestures. It sounded simple, but it was anything but. Washing dishes required awareness of every arm movement, every shift of weight. Carrying a cup of coffee demanded balance and grace I didn't know I possessed. Even answering a simple question from her demanded attention to tone, posture, and expression. Each action, mundane in isolation, had become a test of presence, a demonstration of my capacity to inhabit this new identity fully. At one point, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror and froze. The reflection no longer seemed like a temporary mask or an imposed persona. The face staring back at me was softer, more aware, but unmistakably mine. The subtle arch of my eyebrows, the gentle slope of my cheeks, the way my lips pressed together in concentration. It was me, yet not the me I had thought I knew. A cold wave of realization hit me. This was no longer just a punishment. This was a transformation, deliberate, slow, and inescapable. And the thought terrified me. Throughout the day, my wife observed me with a quiet intensity that left no room for distraction. She didn't correct me constantly, but the weight of her gaze ensured that I remained conscious of every movement, every expression. It was exhausting, mentally and physically, but with exhaustion came reflection. I began to notice how my emotions shifted as I moved through the day, how vulnerability brought clarity, how awareness bred a strange sense of humility I had never known. The person I had been, careless and arrogant, seemed distant, almost unreal. And the more I noticed, the more I realized that the transformation wasn't limited to my appearance, it had crept into the deepest corners of my mind. By evening, after hours of deliberate movement, reflection, and journaling, I felt a profound fatigue unlike anything I had experienced. My muscles ached from the unnatural grace I was practicing, but deeper than that, my mind felt stretched, raw, alert. I stared at myself in the mirror once more, tracing the contours of my face and body, trying to reconcile the person I saw with the man I had been. And for the first time, I recognized a spark of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: accountability. This wasn't just a punishment for betrayal, it was a reckoning with every choice I had ever made, and the consequences were unavoidable. I wrote long into the night, filling the pages with observations, emotions, and reluctant revelations. I wrote about the subtle power of being seen, of inhabiting a space fully and consciously. I wrote about the vulnerability that had become both a cage and a mirror. And finally, I wrote about a strange, terrifying hope, that perhaps this forced journey into exposure and awareness could teach me something I had never truly learned: how to see myself honestly, without the shields, the lies, or the deflections I had always relied on. By the 9th day, I was beginning to sense a shift I hadn't expected. The initial panic, humiliation, and resistance had evolved into something more complicated, more insidious. I was aware of myself in ways I hadn't been before, noticing every nuance of posture, expression, and movement. The dress, once a symbol of punishment, had become a constant companion, a reminder that I could not hide, that I could not return to the careless arrogance I had once carried so easily. And yet, I realized with unease that part of me had begun to feel comfortable. Not comfort in the sense of safety, but a strange acceptance of the exposure and awareness she had forced upon me. That morning, she asked me to prepare breakfast, moving through the kitchen with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. I followed her instructions carefully, adjusting my stance, softening my gestures, and monitoring the sound of my voice as I spoke. Every motion felt deliberate, weighted with significance I could hardly articulate. As I moved, I noticed her watching, but this time her expression was less critical and more observant, almost like a scientist studying a complex experiment. I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly, replaced by a growing awareness of what it meant to inhabit this space fully, to be present in my own body in a way I had never allowed before. After breakfast, she had me practice walking in the living room again, emphasizing poise, balance, and elegance. At first, I stumbled, the hem of the dress catching awkwardly underfoot. But with each repetition, I grew steadier, more deliberate, more conscious of the subtle sway of my body and the rhythm of my steps. In the mirror, I saw someone learning, evolving, reshaping themselves under scrutiny. The reflection no longer felt like a mask or a punishment. It was a part of me that I had been avoiding, a version of myself that could only emerge through exposure and self-awareness. Later, she handed me my journal and instructed me to write about the person I was becoming. I hesitated, unsure if I could articulate the swirling mix of shame, revelation, and curiosity. But as the pen touched the page, words began to flow. I wrote about the vulnerability I felt in every gesture, the strange clarity of inhabiting a space fully and consciously, the realization that empathy and awareness could not be learned through avoidance. I wrote about the small, subtle moments of pride I felt when I corrected a posture, softened a tone, or moved with more grace than before. And in writing, I recognized a truth I had long ignored, that this punishment, this forced transformation, was teaching me not only to see myself but to understand the impact of my actions on others. By evening, exhaustion and awareness intertwined. I sat in front of the mirror once more, the dress flowing softly around me, the contours of my body framed in a way that demanded acknowledgement. I traced the lines of my face and shoulders, observing the soft, unfamiliar symmetry, and felt a mixture of fear, humiliation, and awe. The man I had been, careless and arrogant, seemed distant, almost foreign. The person staring back at me was fragile, aware, and undeniably present. And I realized, with a mixture of dread and fascination, that I could not undo this transformation, no matter how much I might wish it. I had been reshaped, exposed, and confronted in ways I could never have imagined, and somehow, despite every pang of discomfort, I knew I was learning to live within this new self. The 10th day dawned quietly, almost deceptively normal. I rose with the familiar tension in my chest, aware that nothing about me, or my life, was normal anymore. The dress, the accessories, the posture, the voice, they had become a part of my daily rhythm, as unavoidable as breathing. Yet, underneath the routine, something profound had shifted. I wasn't just performing anymore, I was observing, reflecting, and understanding in ways that terrified and exhilarated me simultaneously. The exposure had become a mirror not just for my appearance, but for the man I had been, the choices I had made, and the consequences I could no longer deny. She appeared in the doorway, her calm presence radiating authority and quiet expectation. "Today," she said, "you look back at yourself not just to see, but to understand. Everything you've experienced, the fear, the shame, the awareness, is part of this reckoning. Have you learned to notice?" My throat tightened. I wanted to say no, wanted to cling to my old self, the arrogance and denial that had once shielded me from reality. But looking at her, at the reflection I had come to recognize in the mirror, I realized that denial was no longer possible. I had seen too much, felt too deeply, understood too clearly. I moved through the day with a deliberate awareness I had never known. Breakfast, chores, speech, posture, gestures, they were no longer exercises, but extensions of my presence in the world, in my own skin. I noticed the softness of the fabric against my arms, the subtle sway of the dress with every step, the way my reflection shifted as I tilted my head or softened my gaze. Every moment was an encounter with myself, a confrontation with vulnerability I had always feared. I realized that the punishment had never been about humiliation alone. It had been about forcing me to inhabit the consequences of my actions, to face the person I had avoided for so long. In the evening, she handed me my journal one last time. "Read what you've written," she said. "See how far you've come, not in spite of yourself, but because of what you've faced." I read, and for the first time, I didn't feel shame as I traced the pages. I saw fear and struggle, yes, but also awareness, humility, and a growing understanding of who I could become. The reflection in the mirror no longer mocked or challenged me. It quietly demanded that I take responsibility, that I continue to notice, continue to feel, continue to grow. And in that quiet moment, I understood that I had been transformed in a way that went far beyond clothing or posture. I had been forced to confront my ego, my mistakes, my vulnerability, and in doing so, I had begun to understand empathy, awareness, and self-reflection on a level I had never experienced before. The man I had been, careless, arrogant, blind, was no longer all there was. And the new self, fragile and uncertain, exposed and aware, was waiting to be lived fully, every day, in every gesture, every glance, every movement. I took a deep breath, tracing the soft lines of my reflection one last time. The dress, the voice, the posture, they were still there, but they were no longer chains. They were mirrors, lessons, reminders of what it meant to truly see, truly feel, and truly inhabit the consequences of my choices. And for the first time, I realized that this reckoning, this forced transformation, had given me something I had never imagined. Not punishment, not shame, but clarity, and the possibility of becoming someone better than the man I once was.